In June 1930, the United States Congress passed a law that economists would later call one of the most destructive policy decisions in modern history. It wasn't a war declaration. It wasn't a military order. It was a tariff. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act raised import duties on over 20,000 goods. The logic seemed reasonable. Protect American workers, keep foreign products out, keep American money inside American borders. Within 2 years, global trade contracted by 65%. Not slowed, not reduced, collapsed. 25 nations retaliated immediately. Canada, Britain, France, Germany, every major trading partner raised their own barriers. The global economy didn't just contract, it fragmented. And in that fragmentation, while the United States spiraled deeper into the Great Depression, one country quietly gathered the pieces. A silent winner. History recorded Smoot-Hawley as a historic policy miscalculation. What history rarely asks is, who benefited? Because in every trade, war ever fought, someone always benefits. The question this documentary asks, the one that matters most in 2026, is not whether America's current trade war will cause damage. The financial trail already answers that. The question is, who is the silent winner this time? To understand what happened in 1930, you need to understand what America was trying to protect. The 1920s had been a decade of extraordinary American industrial expansion, steel production, automobile manufacturing, agricultural output that fed half the world. American workers earned more, produced more, and consumed more than any population in history. And then, in October 1929, the stock market fell apart. Fear spread faster than facts. Factories cut production. Banks called in loans. Unemployment climbed from 3% to 9% inside 12 months. Farmers watched crop prices fall below the cost of growing them. Congress reached for the most instinctive tool in the political arsenal: protection. Senator Reed Smoot of Utah and Representative Willis Hawley of Oregon introduced their bill in 1929. The original proposal targeted agricultural goods, a response to falling farm prices. But as the bill moved through Congress, every industry with a lobbyist added its products to the list. By the time the act was signed into law on June 17, 1930, it covered more than 20,000 imported goods. Average tariff rates on dutiable imports rose to nearly 45%, the highest in peacetime American history. President Herbert Hoover had doubts. More than 1,000 economists signed a petition urging him to veto it. He signed it anyway. The economists' petition warned of exactly what would follow: foreign retaliation, reduced exports, higher prices for American consumers. It described, with remarkable precision, the mechanism that was about to be set in motion. That mechanism is not complicated, but it is almost never explained in full. The Smoot-Hawley Act didn't just cause a depression. It handed power to a country that would use it to change the world forever. That country wasn't an ally. But before we get there, we need to understand exactly how a tariff becomes a structural unraveling. A tariff looks simple on paper. You import a foreign product. The government adds a tax. The foreign product becomes more expensive. Domestic producers gain a competitive advantage. That's the theory. Here's what actually happens. Step 1. The tariff goes up. Foreign goods become more expensive inside the United States. American consumers pay more for everything from shoes to sugar to steel. Step 2. Foreign governments retaliate. They raise their own tariffs on American exports. American farmers can no longer sell wheat to Canada. American manufacturers lose European markets. Step 3. Global trade volumes contract. With barriers rising everywhere, international commerce slows. Supply chains built over decades start to break. Step 4. Domestic prices rise. With fewer imports competing in the market, American producers raise their prices. Inflation begins. Consumers spend less. Step 5. Businesses contract. With falling exports and rising input costs, American companies cut production and workers. Step 6. The financial system strains. Banks that lent money to export industries face mounting defaults. Credit tightens. Investment falls. By 1932, American GDP had fallen 29% from its 1929 peak. Unemployment reached 25%. Industrial production fell by half. International trade, the engine that had powered American prosperity through the 1920s, had contracted to a third of its pre-war levels. Historical evidence strongly suggests that Smoot-Hawley didn't cause the Great Depression alone. The stock market crash, the banking failures, the Federal Reserve's contraction of the money supply, all of these contributed. But the tariffs made everything worse. They closed the exits at exactly the moment the economy needed them most. And they did something else. Something that rarely appears in the standard economic analysis. They created a vacuum. When the world's largest economy retreats behind walls, it doesn't disappear from the global stage. It leaves space. And in 1930, that space was not left empty for long. The conventional history of the 1930s focuses on suffering, the breadlines in America, the deflation in Britain, the political instability spreading across Europe. What that history tends to underemphasize is who was moving while everyone else was standing still. Germany in 1930 was a country under enormous strain. The reparations from World War I had crushed its economy. Hyperinflation in 1923 had wiped out the savings of an entire generation. Unemployment was high, political tension was extreme. But Germany had something that other industrial nations had temporarily lost: the structural motivation to rebuild its export relationships outside the traditional Western trading system. As American and British trade barriers rose, Germany's government began negotiating bilateral trade agreements with countries in South America, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. These agreements operated outside the fracturing multilateral system. Germany offered manufactured goods in exchange for raw materials: oil, food, metals. Between 1933 and 1938, Germany's share of trade with these regions grew substantially, while American and British influence contracted. The policy decisions that drove this expansion, the structural forces that created those incentives, were directly shaped by the space that Smoot-Hawley had opened. This is the mechanism that financial historians call the vacuum effect. Trade wars don't eliminate trade. They redirect it. And whoever is positioned to capture the redirected flows, whoever has the relationships, the capacity, and the willingness to move quickly, becomes the silent winner. It happened in 1930. The pattern would return. Most people know August 15th, 1971, as the day Nixon ended the gold standard. Fewer people know what else he announced that night. Hidden inside the same speech, buried beneath the monetary news that would dominate the headlines, was a 10% surcharge on all imports entering the United States. A tariff shock. Nixon's move was framed as a temporary measure, a negotiating tool to force America's trading partners to revalue their currencies upward against the dollar. The Bretton Woods system was straining. The dollar was overvalued. American exports were losing competitiveness. The tariff, Nixon's team argued, would last only until the monetary system was renegotiated. It lasted 4 months. The Smithsonian Agreement in December 1971 produced a new set of exchange rates, and the surcharge was lifted. But the consequences were not temporary. The dollar devaluation that followed Bretton Woods made American imports more expensive immediately. Combined with the oil embargo of 1973, itself partly a consequence of the geopolitical realignments that Nixon's monetary shock had triggered, the United States entered a decade of stagflation. Inflation that peaked at 13.5% in 1979, unemployment rising simultaneously, an economy that appeared, for the first time in a generation, genuinely vulnerable. Nixon's move in 1971 wasn't just about gold. Hidden inside that announcement was a tariff that most historians still don't talk about, and its consequences lasted 20 years. And while America wrestled with its inflationary decade, Japan was building the industrial capacity that would define the next era of global manufacturing. The vacuum effect, again, different decade, same mechanism. By the early 1980s, American steel and automobile manufacturers were in serious trouble. Japanese and German producers had spent the 1970s investing in modern equipment and efficient production methods. American manufacturers, protected by decades of domestic dominance, had been slower to adapt. The result was a competitiveness gap that was widening every year. Ronald Reagan, ideologically committed to free markets, faced a political reality that free market theory couldn't resolve. The industrial heartland of America was losing jobs. Congressional pressure was intense. Something had to be done. Reagan's administration negotiated what were called voluntary export restraints, agreements with Japan and other trading partners to limit their exports to the United States voluntarily in exchange for avoiding formally imposed tariffs. They were, in substance, tariffs by another name. The steel and automobile industries received a temporary reprieve, but the structural problems were not resolved. They were deferred. American manufacturers used the breathing room to lobby for continued protection rather than to invest in the modernization they needed. Meanwhile, Japan redirected its industrial energy. Car manufacturers moved production to the United States itself, building factories in states with lower labor costs, below the political radar of the trade restrictions. South Korean manufacturers began entering markets that Japanese firms had been forced to partially exit. The vacuum effect, operating again. More sophisticated this time, more patient. Reagan's trade barriers didn't stop foreign competition. They changed its shape, and they accelerated the structural decline of American manufacturing in ways that became fully visible only in the decades that followed. The warning was there, in the data, in the historical pattern. Nobody wanted to hear it. 3 cycles, 3 different presidents, 3 different political contexts, but underneath each one, the same financial mechanism operating with remarkable consistency. Here is how tariffs erode monetary hegemony, and why this matters far beyond the economics of trade. When the United States imposes tariffs, it raises the cost of imported goods. American consumers and businesses pay more. Inflation rises. The Federal Reserve is forced to respond, typically by raising interest rates. Higher interest rates strengthen the dollar in the short term, but they also slow domestic investment, raise the cost of servicing the national debt, and reduce the competitiveness of American exports. Simultaneously, trading partners who face American tariffs begin searching for alternatives. Alternative suppliers, alternative currencies, alternative systems for conducting international trade. This is not a dramatic, sudden shift. It is a gradual one. Erosion, not explosion. But erosion is how empires lose their foundations. The British pound didn't unravel overnight after World War II. It lost its reserve currency status slowly through a series of trade imbalances, debt accumulations, and structural realignments that each seemed manageable in isolation. The cumulative effect was irreversible. Historical evidence suggests that reserve currency transitions follow a similar pattern: years of slow erosion, then a moment of rapid recognition that the shift has already occurred. Each American trade war has accelerated this erosion slightly. Smoot-Hawley created bilateral trading relationships outside the dollar system. Nixon's shock broke the gold-dollar link permanently. Reagan's protection demonstrated that American trade policy was politically volatile, not the stable anchor that reserve currency status requires. Every trade war in American history has followed the same 6-step sequence. Step 4 is where empires stop noticing what's happening to them. In 2025 and 2026, America is running the sequence again. The question is, which step we're on? Step back far enough, and the pattern becomes unmistakable. 1930. Domestic economic pressure, political demand for protection, tariff legislation, foreign retaliation, trade contraction, inflation, recession, vacuum created, silent winner emerges. 1971. Structural economic pressure, dollar overvalued, import surcharge, currency realignment, inflationary decade. Japan fills the industrial vacuum. 1980s. Competitive pressure from foreign manufacturers. Voluntary export restraints. Short-term relief. Structural decline deferred. South Korea and transplant factories fill the vacuum. 3 cycles. 40 years. The names change. The mechanism doesn't. What's particularly striking, when you examine the historical record, is not the similarity of the causes. It's the similarity of the response. In each case, policymakers understood the theoretical risks. Economists warned loudly. Historical precedents were cited. And in each case, short-term political logic overrode long-term structural reasoning. This is not a failure of intelligence. It's a structural feature of democratic political systems operating under electoral pressures. The people who bear the immediate cost of foreign competition, factory workers, steel producers, farmers, are concentrated, organized, and politically vocal. The people who bear the diffuse, long-term cost of protectionism, consumers paying higher prices, exporters losing markets, the entire economy experiencing slower growth, are dispersed, unorganized, and largely silent. The pattern persists because the incentive structure that produces it persists, which brings us to 2025 and 2026. The trade war that began intensifying in 2025 carries the structural fingerprints of every cycle that preceded it. Domestic economic pressure. Manufacturing employment in the United States had been declining for decades, concentrated in precisely the regions with the highest political sensitivity. Political demand for protection. Tariffs were presented as instruments of leverage, tools to force China to alter its trade practices, reduce its subsidies to domestic industries, and open its markets to American goods. The specific tariff rates imposed in 2025 reached levels not seen since the Smoot-Hawley era. The political logic was familiar. So were the initial responses. China retaliated with precision. Rather than matching tariff for tariff across the board, Beijing targeted American agricultural exports, soybeans, pork, corn, products that come predominantly from states with high political significance. The European Union raised its own concerns about the structural disruption to global supply chains, accelerating conversations about reducing dollar dependency in international trade settlements. Then came the Supreme Court. The court's decision to curtail executive tariff authority, constraining the legal basis for the broadest measures, created immediate uncertainty. Markets responded to the legal ambiguity, but the structural forces that the tariffs had set in motion didn't pause for the legal proceedings. Trade relationships redirected under pressure don't automatically reverse when the pressure eases. Supply chains rebuilt around Chinese restrictions don't dismantle themselves when tariffs are reduced. Bilateral agreements negotiated in the shadow of American trade barriers don't disappear because Washington changes course. The erosion, once begun, has its own momentum. The Supreme Court's decision didn't end the trade war. It revealed something far more important about where American power actually lives, and who has been quietly moving into the spaces America is leaving behind. The retaliation chain of 2025 and 2026 does not look like 1930s immediate contraction. The global economy is larger, more complex, and more interconnected than it was a century ago. The adjustment mechanisms are more sophisticated. The pain is more distributed. But the pattern of winners and losers is consistent with what history shows. Countries that have built industrial capacity outside the direct line of the US-China conflict are absorbing redirected trade flows at a pace that was not possible in earlier cycles. Vietnam, India, Mexico, Indonesia all have seen manufacturing investment accelerate as supply chains shift away from Chinese factories facing American tariffs. But there is a distinction that matters enormously, and that the historical pattern makes clear. There is a difference between countries absorbing the immediate industrial displacement, the assembly work, the component manufacturing, the labor-intensive production, and the country that captures the strategic position. In 1930, many countries absorbed pieces of the redirected trade, but Germany captured the strategic position, the political relationships, the bilateral dependencies, the structural influence that would define the next decade of global power. The question for 2026 is not which countries are winning the immediate industrial displacement. The question is, which country is capturing the strategic position? The financial trail points in a direction that the historical pattern makes difficult to ignore. China entered this trade war in a structurally different position than the countries that faced Smoot-Hawley in 1930. It is not a peripheral economy waiting for an opportunity. It is the world's largest manufacturing nation, the largest trading partner for more than 120 countries, and the primary architect of an alternative trade infrastructure that has been under construction for more than a decade. The Belt and Road Initiative, regardless of how one assesses its strategic intent, represents exactly the kind of long-term relationship building that Germany pursued in the 1930s through its bilateral trade agreements. Infrastructure for influence. Access for dependency. When American tariffs push trading partners to find alternative arrangements, the alternative arrangements that exist, that have been built and funded and staffed over the past decade, are largely Chinese. This does not mean the outcome is determined. History shows that structural advantages can be squandered, that geopolitical miscalculations can reverse apparent momentum, that economies are more resilient and adaptive than any single analysis suggests. But history also shows something else. Trade wars don't end when the tariffs are lifted. They end when the structural realignments they produce become permanent. When the new relationships, the new supply chains, the new dependencies have solidified enough that returning to the previous configuration is no longer possible. In 1930, the structural realignment that Smoot-Hawley produced took approximately a decade to become fully visible. The financial trail from 2025 is shorter. The mechanisms are faster. The players are more deliberate. The silent winner of this trade war may not be silent for very much longer. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with uncomfortable precision. Smoot-Hawley, the Nixon shock, Reagan's voluntary restraints. 3 moments when American policymakers chose protection over position, and 3 moments when someone else quietly moved into the space that protection created. The mechanism is not a secret. It has been documented, analyzed, and warned about by economists and historians for nearly a century. The 6-step sequence from tariff to inflation, to recession, to vacuum, to silent winner, runs through the financial record like a watermark, and yet the pattern persists. Because the incentive structure that produces it, the concentrated political pressure of those who need protection today versus the diffuse long-term cost paid by everyone tomorrow, is more powerful than historical awareness. In 2026, the United States is somewhere in the middle of that sequence. Where exactly? That depends on which historical parallel you find most convincing, and on whether the structural realignments already in motion prove reversible, or whether, as in 1930, they have already passed the point where reversal is possible without anyone noticing. The financial trail doesn't make predictions. It asks questions that the evidence forces you to take seriously. Here is the one that history leaves open. In 1930, the silent winner wasn't an ally. In 1971, it was a country America had rebuilt from rubble. In the 1980s, it was a competitor America had underestimated. In 2026, which of those 3 describes the country that has been quietly, patiently, and deliberately waiting for this moment? The trail doesn't end here. If you want to be there when the next trail is uncovered, the notification bell is the only way we can guarantee you'll know.